Now? Okay, it's Thursday, July 17th, 2008. My name is Steve Brown. I'm with the Cantigny First Division Oral History Project, and I'm here in Hudson, Ohio with Mr. Bob Kindel. Is it Bob, Robert?
Well, technically Robert.
Do you prefer?
I prefer Bob.
Okay. We're here with Mr. Bob Kindel, and we are going to discuss his experience in the military in Vietnam. Mr. Kindel, can you spell your last name for us, please?
Sure. It's Kindel.
And where were you born? And
Wadsworth, Ohio.
When were you born?
June 3rd, 1947.
What was your family like?
Well, I'm one of 8 children, working class family, Catholic, blue collar. I was the first kid in my family ever to go to college.
And
Only the second to graduate from high school.
Really? Were you in college at the time of the draft?
I was, but I dropped out for a semester because I had to work full-time to earn some money to go back to school.
Where were you working?
I was working at Barberton Citizens Hospital. I was a nursing orderly.
Okay. And what were you studying in college at the time?
I was an English major.
Where at?
At Kent State, the Wadsworth branch.
Okay. So you're working part-time as a nurse's aide and going to Kent State.
Right.
And you drop out of school.
To go full-time. And I got a letter from...
To go to work full-time?
Yeah. And I got a letter from Nixon saying, greetings from the president. Show up and get a physical.
So in other words, you dropped out and you would have lost your deferment.
Right. Because I dropped out to go full-time so I could go back and keep my deferment. I figured a semester was safe.
Okay.
It wasn't.
It wasn't. Okay.
No.
So you get the letter.
Yeah. And then I decided to enlist because this is kind of ironic, I was afraid that if I got drafted, they'd send me to the infantry. So I enlisted to become a medic.
Okay.
Figuring I would go to advanced medical training, go what they called 91C school, clinical specialist program, and 98% of those people work in hospitals. 2% are assigned to combat arms to run the aid stations.
Okay. So you enlisted,
Right.
As opposed to being drafted. And what happened next?
Well, as I said, I went through training. I went through basic, did well in basic, got promoted E2 out of basic. Went on to AIT, medical AIT, got promoted E3. They picked me, you had to pass AIT with a 95% score to get in 91C school, got into 91C school. The fact that I was an orderly for 3 years helped a lot. Promoted me E4, went through 91C school, did really well, graduated, and they sent me my orders, and mine were for the First Infantry Division, Republic of Vietnam.
Let me ask you a couple questions. What was the transition from soldier or civilian to soldier like for you? Basic.
Not bad. I mean, I was always a pretty active person, and what they wanted was somebody that knew how to shoot, and I was a hunter, was in decent physical shape to do the push-ups and the running and everything, and I could do that. And I come from a family of 8, so I'm used to having a lot of roommates. So basic really, it wasn't as bad for me as I think for a lot of the kids that had no idea what they were doing or just couldn't accept the fact that someone told you when to wake up and would wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning, take your locker on the street so they could inspect it.
Were you in athletics in high school? Or?
No, not
really. But you were an outdoorsman?
I was outdoors, but in high school I didn't believe in team sports.
Okay.
I was the class intellectual.
Okay.
I was an English major. What are you going to do?
There you go.
I was the rebel.
Okay. You get done with basic.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you do your basic?
Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Fort Knox. And where'd you go for your AIT?
Fort Sam Houston, Texas.
Now, what did that consist of?
That consisted of 10-week course, basic medic training, the kind of stuff I'd been doing for years, making beds, putting bandages on, every afternoon right after lunch, they'd take us in and show us a film about abdominal surgery to see who was going to throw up so they could wash them out. And, I worked the emergency room, so, watching somebody bleed on film is nothing compared to watching them bleed in real life. So I had no trouble with AIT.
And they did that every day. You watched the film about
Usually
it.
right after, we either did that, or if we had field training, they'd take us out and we'd pick each other up on litters and run them up and down the hills of Fort Sam Houston so we could get used to transporting patients.
And okay, same abdominal surgery every time?
Pretty much. They wanted something really gory to see who was going to throw up so you wouldn't waste your time completing training and having them go to a hospital and not be able to do it.
How many washed out as a result of that?
I think only about 10-15%.
Okay.
Most people either shut their eyes or just didn't eat much lunch.
Okay. You're done at Fort Sam Houston. Where do you go next?
Well, I got my first leave. I didn't get a leave after Fort Knox. And then I went to Womack Army Hospital at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
What'd you do on leave?
Went home, drank, chased women, the usual stuff.
Notice any difference about yourself and the way you were received or the way you interacted with everybody?
Not really, no. No, there was talk about, people having a lot of trouble when they were in the Army, with civilians, calling them baby killers, etc. But I lived in a small town in Ohio, in the Midwest, and nobody, if anything, people respected the fact I was in the service.
And you entered in '67.
Right.
So the anti-war movement has started at this point. It's starting to rev up.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
And you were aware of that.
Oh, yeah. I agreed with it. I didn't think we belonged over there.
Okay. If you agreed with that, why did you sign up?
Well, because my grandparents were Hungarian immigrants. And they talked a lot about how bad it was in the old country and how great America was. And I figured if this is what they want me to do, okay, that's what I'm paying for.
Is Kindel an anglicized version of something else? Do you know?
Kindelbrücken.
Okay.
Yeah, they were Hungarian, but Grandpa was Austro-Hungarian, so it was basically a German name.
Okay. And they were the first ones off the boat in your
Right.
family. Okay.
Yeah.
They speak English?
Yes and no. My grandmother could speak English, but wouldn't. My grandfather spoke a very broken English.
Okay.
My father, of course, spoke Hungarian and German, but he didn't want any of the kids to learn the languages because we were Americans, which I regret.
You go back from leave,
Mm-hmm.
and you go to
Fort Bragg,
Womack
Army Hospital. Yeah.
Army Hospital.
That's where I took my 91C training.
Okay. What did 91C training
It's
consist of?
a 40-week program, and essentially it was the forerunner of the PA program, the Physician's Assistant program. We were trained in all branches of medicine. We were taught to work independently. It's pretty much what they do in PA school in 2 years now. We did in one year. And it was before Vietnam. It was only for people that had been in the military for 5 or more years and had achieved E6 or better in their profession. With Vietnam, there was such a need for them that they started cranking out, and they started grabbing, people with some college that they figured could get through the course.
And
It was a fairly intensive course. We lost, I think our class lost 67% of the people that started.
when you say all branches of medicine, what sorts of things?
Like
did you-
OR techs, basic medics, lab techs, people that were in the medical, what they call the medical services.
OR would be operating room.
Yeah.
Okay. What did you take out of that? What was the most important thing that you took out of that training that you remember?
The most important thing I took out of it is that if you're in a situation where somebody's going to die, you got to do something. It may not be the right thing, but you got to be in there trying. You got to do what you think is best.
To try and prevent them from dying.
Right.
Did you learn about triage?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had a course in triage. We had a course in as I said, most of the physical systems. We spent a lot of time in the hospital. We learned to suture. I delivered 3 babies while I was there in the delivery room.
For somebody who was on base, the wife of somebody on base?
Yeah, yeah. The hospital treated soldiers and their dependents.
Okay.
So we went through all the rotations.
With a doctor?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
In learning about triage, you would have had to learn to assess the viability of a patient.
Yeah.
What was it like to learn to say, this person doesn't have much of a chance. Therefore, we need to treat these people first.
Right.
What was that like for you?
It was difficult, but on the other hand, I'd worked emergency room long enough to know that sometimes you have to go with the people you're going to help.
How do you justify that in your mind?
Because if you spend too much time on the person that's probably not going to make it, you might lose the people that could make it.
So you'll end up with 2 dead instead of 1.
Right.
Okay.
And as I said, the whole focus was on keeping people alive when you could.
What did you think about your 91C training?
Well, at the time, I thought I could do anything. It was only when I got a little bit of experience, a little practice, I realized how much I didn't know. But the whole focus was to make you think that if you can't do it, at least you got enough information, you can give it a shot.
Was there any particular focus on treatment of battle wounds or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, we spent more time in the emergency room than anywhere.
Okay.
And since Fort Bragg was not only a training camp, it was the Green Beret training camp, we had a lot of interesting training accidents.
What were some of the most interesting training accidents?
Well, the stupidest one I ever saw was a Green Beret who was trying to show how macho he was. So he took a practice grenade, pulled the pin and held it above his head to show the troops that this is a practice grenade, forgetting that it did have a detonator in it. And he lost the thumb, this finger, and the little... For some reason, this finger was okay.
So needless to
He'd been
say...
drinking at the time.
Okay.
We had a lot of burns. We had a lot of suturing. Learning to suture was easy because they used the air guns to give vaccines. And the air gun shoots compressed air, shoots the vaccine into the arm. And if the person jerks, it gives you a nice 1/4 inch deep, straight cut that you can suture very easily. And it was a great way to learn to suture.
How many of those did you have to do?
Oh, 8 or 9 a day sometimes. Depend when they gave shots at the basic training center.
Okay. You go through 40 weeks.
Yeah.
What happens then?
Well, then I got my orders. I was supposed to go on a 45-day leave and delay in transit before I went to Vietnam. I had 15 more days to do, and the first sergeant told me that if I shaved my mustache off, he'd just forget about those 15 days, tell me to go home. So I shaved my mustache off and took a 2-month leave.
Okay.
We were allowed to wear mustaches then, but the the lifers didn't particularly care for it.
So your thinking was, I can grow this back within the time I'm on leave?
Yeah, or if I want to. I wasn't sure about the mustache. It was one of those authority things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where'd you go for your leave?
I went home.
Okay.
Spent time with my family.
What was it like?
Weird.
Okay, this time it's weird.
Yeah, because
First time.
I was going to Vietnam, and my mother was protective, kind of smothering almost.
What did she do?
Oh, I always wanted to know where I was going, what I was doing.
Okay. How did you feel about that?
I just figured it was Mom.
Mom being mom? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else weird about it?
Not really.
Okay.
Went out, raised hell with my friends. And
So when you went home, you knew you were being assigned to the First Division?
no, I knew I was going to Vietnam.
Okay.
But see, I also knew that 98% of 91Cs wound up going to hospital units. And I
In
figured a
Vietnam.
hospital in Vietnam would be no worse than a hospital in inner city Cleveland. So, you know.
So you figured, oh, I'll probably end up in Saigon in a hospital somewhere or something
Yeah.
like that.
It was when I got overseas and they gave me my definite orders, I knew I was going to the First Division.
Okay. Tell me about getting overseas. What was it like? What was Mom like on the day you left?
Very stiff upper lip.
How about Dad?
No, he thought it was a good idea.
For you to go?
Well, that's if that's what I wanted to do.
Okay.
He did tell me if I wanted to go back to Canada, I could do that too.
Back to Canada?
Well, it was the 60s, and we used to get a newspaper called the Toronto Star. And Toronto had an area, it still has, but it's a yuppie area now, called Yorkville, which was like the Village, only it was a sanitized version. It was a Canadian version of hippiedom.
Greenwich Village.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so every once in a while, I'd go up there for a week or two and hang around and live the hippie life.
Okay.
So I had friends up there.
Okay. Okay. And your dad suggested you might go there?
No, he said if I wanted to, that was okay with him. My dad was very laissez-faire, you know.
Okay.
What he wanted us to do was be happy,
Okay.
regardless of what that was.
How were your siblings with the whole situation?
Well, I have one brother that's a lifer, and he thought it was good. He hoped I'd wind up in the 25th because that's where he was.
Was he over there at the time?
No, he'd been there. Actually, he hadn't been over there. He'd been with the 25th when it was still in Hawaii, but his unit was moving over too. And you know, he still thought of himself as that. But he was stationed. He was going to Alaska.
Okay.
My other siblings, they were pretty much, you know, do what you want to do.
Okay. What was your first impression of Vietnam?
Hot, smelly, damp.
Where'd you land?
I landed at Benoit Air Base. Got out. We got our final orders down there.
They process you in country there?
Yeah,
How long did that take?
a couple hours. And there was a bus from the First Division that was picking up all the new recruits.
Okay.
Took us over to First Division. Really hokey introduction to what was going on. We were sitting in Xi'an, which was First Division headquarters, in a big meeting room, sitting on chairs, and the guy was talking about how we're in country now and we got to watch out, and all of a sudden somebody starts firing an AK. He says, "Watch out, snipers, get down!" And I mean, you know, here we are in the middle of a fortified camp, and they want us to believe that the NVA infiltrated in the middle of the day, firing. But basically what it did is it taught us the difference between how an AK sounded and how an M16 sounded,
Okay.
which was useful information.
Okay.
And I stayed there a day and a half.
How did most of the other recruits take that?
It was
They
mixed.
weren't recruits, were they?
No,
At this
they
point
were.
there?
Some of them were on their second or third tour, and I saw a lot of smirks. Some guys actually did hit the ground.
Okay.
I kind of crouched because I wasn't sure. You know, I was pretty sure, but it was my first time.
Okay. You're there a day and a half. What
Yeah.
happens then?
Well, they split us up, decided where we were going. I found out I was going to the 2nd and the 28th.
And where were they located?
They were located in YK, which was southwest, I think, from Xi'an.
Okay. On Route 13.
Yeah. See, I'm not, the geography always, because when I traveled, I always traveled either by truck that somebody else was driving or helicopters. So I got in, and when I wound up there, I wound up there.
Okay. So you get to Lake High.
YK.
Like
Yeah.
A.
Yeah.
I have more trouble with that.
Yeah.
Like A.
Yeah.
What are the medical facilities like at Like A?
We had an aid station there.
What's an aid station?
An aid
consist of?
station is an area in the rear, a large building that's set up with stretchers and a little pharmacy and some offices to take care of the medical needs of the people that are in the back. We also had forward aid stations up in fire support bases, and since I was the junior 91C, that's where I wound up.
Okay.
I didn't spend much time in the rear until I'd been in country about 8 months.
At Like A, are there surgical facilities there?
The second surgical hospital was right down the road from us.
Okay. How was that equipped?
It was what they called a must unit. It had the operating rooms were inflatable because they were easier to air condition that way. And then it had some regular buildings. It was a surgical evac hospital, which meant that it was heavy on surgery, light on everything else, because anything else was sent back down to Benoit or Saigon.
At Like A, who's your immediate superior?
It was I had three. I had the first sergeant, I had the medical service officer, and I had the battalion surgeon.
Okay. The first sergeant, is he a medical specialist?
Well, I mean, by first sergeant, I meant the head of the medical platoon. He was actually a sergeant first class.
And he's a
A
medic?
Yeah, he was a 91B.
Do you remember his name?
Actually, I don't, because like I said, I didn't stay back there that often.
And, okay, so you had
Him.
the sergeant.
I had the medical service officer, Lieutenant Boudreau.
Okay, and
I
he's
remembered
a
him 'cause
physician?
No, he was, I think his degree was in biology. He was an administrative officer.
Okay.
He was a real jerk.
Why do
was
you
from-
say that?
Well, he's from the University of Mississippi. And he wanted to look really cool. He wanted to be, one of the guys. He wanted to, but he just didn't understand, One day I was sitting there reading, I think I was reading Hamlet for some reason. Seemed appropriate at the time. And he walks in and looks at me, and he's a graduate of the University of Southern Mississippi with a degree in biology, and he knows who Shakespeare is, but he's not quite sure what to say, so he looks at it for a while and says, "Shakespeare, he's good," and walks away,
So
He was a non-entity, basically.
so you didn't have a lot of discussions about the works of William Faulkner with him?
No.
Okay.
No, he could have been in Faulkner, but I don't think he ever read it.
And then you had
And a battalion surgeon.
you had a battalion surgeon.
Yeah, Dr. King.
Okay.
And he was okay.
Okay.
I didn't see much of him because we had two forward support bases. So he was at one and I was at the other. I could call him if I needed help.
Okay. So you're there how long?
About a week. I had to go through in-country training. They had to make sure I could fire a 16, a 79, an M60, that stuff, which I never had to do actually ever again. But, they wanted to make sure I could do that.
Then what happens?
Get in a chopper. They fly me out to one of the fire support bases, fire support base Aachen, I think it was. Somebody meets me there, one of the medics meets me there, shows me where the aid station is, and says, "What do you want us to do?" And I said, "What do you want to do?" And we talked about, I got assimilated what I was supposed to do.
So you're in charge?
I was the treatment NCO, as opposed to the administrative NCO. I was the 91C, so I had the knowledge.
You had the medical training.
Yeah, but the other guys had been in country longer than that, so I let them kind of lead me into what was going on.
At this point, there's no doctor supervising you anymore.
No, there is, but he's at another fire support base.
Okay.
Because the 2nd and the 28th was working in small units, so we had a couple fire support bases.
How large of a unit are you in?
Well, it's a battalion, but the units were operating basically in company strength.
Okay, so about 100 guys.
Yeah. There'd be one unit out, one unit in the fire support base, and one unit on rest back in the rear.
Okay. What was service like at this fire support base?
It was hot. It was actually, I didn't have a lot to do because I set up a training program for the medics that were rotated back into the fire support base. I took sick call. If something was beyond what I could do, I just send them in the chopper back to either the aid station or second surge. I did basic, if somebody hurt themselves in a building, building bunkers or something, I'd treat it. A lot of it, what I did was just supervise the medics who knew what they were doing, so I just let them do it.
Okay.
It wasn't very taxing, actually.
Okay.
The biggest problem was trying to amuse myself.
Okay. How did you do that?
A lot of conversations, a lot of rambling conversations. Every once in a while we'd have a free fire, so I'd go out to the bunker line and practice with weapons I hadn't fired before.
Okay.
The usual stuff.
What sorts of things did you talk about?
Now, remembering that we're a bunch of 19 and 20-year-olds alone, talk about life in general, what we're going to do when we get home. What the Army should be doing instead of what it's doing. Why the command structure had no idea what they were doing, how much better we could do it if we were doing, the usual stuff. One of the problems is that being a 91C, I was in a 5-6 slot.
A 5-6 slot.
I should have been either an E5 or an E6, but I wasn't, because of this hurry up, get you through 91C school, I was still an E4. So nobody knew what to do with me. And eventually I did get promoted to 5, and then about a month later back up to 6. Which, I made E6 in 23 months, which was quite unusual in the service. Most of the lifers said, well, it took me 7 years to make E6. I just shrugged, But because I was in the fast track for the upper level NCOs, some of the lower ranks didn't particularly want to talk to me because they thought I was one of them. But the lifers knew I wasn't one of them, so I wasn't one of them, so I was kind of free-floating. So I didn't have a lot of close friends.
Was there a sense of resentment of the lifers towards you?
Oh, I would say so, yeah.
What sorts of things did they say to indicate that?
They'd said, well, if you'd been in the service long enough, or mostly they were respectful because they knew I was promoted because of knowledge I had. If I'd been promoted because I knew somebody or, put political pressure, that'd be one thing. But, they had to admit I did know my job. We had a couple incidents where there were fairly serious accidents, and, they could see I knew what I was doing.
What were they?
One guy was working up on the tower, working on we had like a little radar thing so that if we got RPGs or mortars, we could see where they were coming from and do counterfire. And he was up there climbing around, and obviously he wasn't wearing a safety belt because he was in the middle of Vietnam, and he fell and he broke, I think the final count was 4 bones in his leg and foot, and broke his arm and a couple ribs, and he's lying half over the bunker, and I got a couple of the medics, and we got him not only off there but stabilized and splinted up and medicated. And got the chopper, got a medevac in right away to get him out.
How long would it take a medevac to get to you?
It depends on where we were. That day it took 15 minutes, which seemed like 3.5 hours. But as soon as I saw him, I told him to call for the medevac. And so by the time the medevac got in, we were just finally putting the last splints on.
Okay, you got one company in, one company out.
Right.
Are they receiving, actively engaged in combat?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, in the fire support bases, it's a lot different than the field. We'd get sniper fire occasionally, or we'd get mortar rounds, or occasional RPGs, but it wasn't bad.
But if we got guys out on an ambush patrol,
yeah,
and they're wounded,
well, they have medics with them.
Okay.
And if they're wounded badly enough, they need to go to evac. The medics would evac them. If they weren't wounded that badly, they'd come back to the aid station and let me take a look at them, and then I'd make the decision whether they were bad enough to evac or not.
What sorts of things were you seeing?
Basically, Not a lot, because usually what happened is they got gunshot wounds, and gunshot wounds were always evac'd. Sometimes people would pick up some shrapnel, and then we'd have to make a decision whether it was going to get infected or not.
And if it's going to get infected,
We'd get them back to the rear where they could be treated more.
and if it's not,
Well, my personal opinion is that shrapnel wound in a jungle is always going to get infected, so get them out.
okay.
And eventually the guys got onto it. And a lot of it was depending on how much fire they were taking. If they were taking a lot of fire, they couldn't call in a medevac. They'd have to wait. But if they weren't, if they had the situation stabilized, they could evac them right away.
Okay. How long did you stay at that fire base?
I spent the first 8 months going from fire base to fire base, so.
Out of Lake High.
Out of IK, yeah.
Lake
I'd go back, every couple weeks I'd go back for 2 or 3 days, get my laundry. That's what I said. I just, I'd go back.
Get your laundry and head back out?
Well, I'd get my laundry, get a haircut, go to the cafe and have a beer and some pommes frites.
Pommes frites.
French fries. See, Vietnam was part of French Indochina,
Yes.
so they had the sidewalk cafe idea, and there was a little cafe there was a native village right next to YK, and about the only thing on the menu was pommes frites and beer. But we'd sit there, we'd get a haircut and then sit there and watch the world go by.
Did you ever have interaction with the villagers?
Oh, quite a bit, because one of the things that we did is there was a program called MedCap. I have no idea what the acronym stands for. But essentially it was medical teams would go out into the village and treat medical problems. The idea was we were supposed to win their hearts and minds by treating them, by letting them know that our medical care was much better than the NVA's medical care.
Was it?
Oh, yeah. We actually had medication. I mean, we could actually go and do things. And
What sorts of things did you do?
well, we basically treated long-term illnesses that people would have. They'd come to us with various infections. I saw 8 or 9 cases of leprosy, which is almost unknown in the United States, and it's fairly easily treated now. And so we had the treatment for it, so we'd give it to them.
What was that?
Oddly enough, it was a medicine called dapazone, which was originally developed for malaria. And it was noticed that the people that took dapazone for malaria never got leprosy, and if you had leprosy to begin with, it would clear it up.
Was this
Streptomycin also worked well.
Hansen's disease or some
Yeah,
other?
yeah, Hansen's disease.
Okay.
That stood me in very good stead, too, because after I got home and I went through nursing school, I had to take state boards. And state boards has a section on medicine. And the year I took it, it was on the mycobacterium, tuberculosis, and Hansen's disease. So, because of what I'd learned over there, I aced boards.
Aside from leprosy, what other sorts of things were you dealing with?
A lot of the chronic, like worms. That's the only phrase I can still remember in Vietnamese is "Sam Sumet," meaning "Do you have worms?" You have to do this apparently, or they don't understand you.
Okay.
It might have been my accent.
Deliver babies, anything like that?
Yeah, it was done, but I didn't do it. We'd go out usually in the middle of the day, do about an hour and a half of medical treatment, see everybody that needed help, and the villagers always felt compelled to feed us lunch.
What was that like?
It was interesting. I'd never had python and bamboo shoots before. It's actually pretty good.
Pretty good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tastes a little bit like alligator.
Okay.
I also had a dish that
Not like chicken, but alligator?
Yeah, more of a reptile taste.
Okay.
Also had a dish that I thought was fried liver, and it turned out to be fried blood.
Oh.
what they would do is when they killed a pig, they would hold it over a pot of boiling water and cut its jugular. The blood would go into the water, the boiling water would coagulate it, and it tasted just like liver. So
You didn't ever have blood sausage growing up in that
No.
Hungarian home?
no,
Okay.
no, that's more Slovenian. We had Hungarian sausage, which is hotter than hell, but
Yeah. Yeah.
my father ate brains, but I never got the taste for it.
Okay, so you had fried blood, and
Yeah.
you had python.
Yeah.
What were the conditions like in these villages?
Actually, some of the people talked about how horrible it was, and to me, it reminded me of the Amish. You know, because they were people that kept things clean. They had a little bit of pride in self, but you know, they were apparently, you know, obviously outhouses and no electricity, no running water. Had a village well.
What were the people like?
When we were there, friendly, because we were there with a full platoon of heavily armed troops. So you know, no, they a lot of them appreciated what we did. A lot of them had no idea what we were doing there. Had no idea why we were giving them these pills and things. One trick we developed with the older population, especially the ones that were lepers, is to give them a shot of vitamin B12 as the initial part of the treatment, because B12 makes you feel good. So you give them a shot of B12, you give them the pills, they take the pills, they think, boy, I feel good. Maybe I ought to keep taking the pills.
Oh, so they associate I feel good with the pill.
Right, even though it was because of the B12. We went through a lot of B12.
Okay.
Had a heck of a time getting it, but we managed.
What effect do you think that had, the whole program?
Made the politicians feel great. It had a temporary good effect on the villagers. I think the people that we were treated that actually got some help out of the medication were helped by it. But if you're talking long-term effect, I don't know. But I've always been a short-term kind of guy, you know.
Why do you say that?
Because I think that, you know, if you worry about what the long-term effects are, it interferes with your ability to do something now.
Okay. Okay. How long did you stay at Like?
We were there, I think, 7 months, and then they moved us up to Dao Tiang, which was closer to the Cambodian border. Oddly enough, they moved us up there because the 9th Infantry had been overrun at Tet of 68, and they wanted the 1st Division up there because the 1st Division had the reputation of never being overrun. It was a well-deserved reputation. We never were.
What was it like up there?
It was... I was fascinated by it because Dao Tiang was right next to the Michelin rubber plantation, and it was an old French colonial town. The architecture was French colonial. The buildings where our aid station was, for example, had tiled roofs and, you know, stone walls. It was more like what I thought a foreign country was. YK had some of that, but it was basically just an army camp thrown up in the middle of nowhere.
What was service like there?
Actually, it was better for me because Tim Berry, who was the 91C that was there before me, senior 91C, finally rotated home, which meant I got to be in the rear aid station.
Okay.
Which means I didn't have to go out in the field, I didn't have to fly around, I didn't have all the crazy stuff. They moved the 2nd Surge at the same time, and so that was still right down the road. And I actually got to go down there and help out occasionally.
So you were helping as a surgeon?
Oh, RTEC. Operating room. I didn't feel I had enough experience in the operating room. And so
So you're functioning sort of like a surgical tech?
off and on when I had chance.
Okay.
You know, I still had my own duties back at the aid station, but, you know, if they needed help, they'd give a call.
What did your duties at the aid station consist of?
Well, by then I was a senior 91C, which means I did a lot of supervising, a lot of reports, a lot of you know, checking the pharmacy, filling out the reports for the morphine and the controlled drugs. making up lies when somebody lost their morphine, so say it was lost in combat, and get 3 officers to sign the form saying that it was.
Why might somebody lose their morphine?
Because the guys in the field, it's kind of chaotic in the field. If you hit an ambush or something, you're crawling around, you've got your pocket open because you're using your morphine. We used to have these little plastic boxes that, you put a pack of cigarettes in, and every medic had 5 morphine syrettes, and they fit perfectly in one of those. So you'd put that in, but guys would lose them.
Okay, what's a syrette?
It's a quarter grain of morphine in a little aluminum foil bag with a needle attached and a wire down the needle and a plastic cap. When you wanted to use it, you pulled the plastic cap on, pushed the wire down to puncture the foil bag, threw the wire away, stuck the needle in somebody's arm and squeezed the bag, and they got a quarter. You didn't have to bother with syringes.
Pre-measured and everything.
Pre-measured everything. Yeah.
So the morphine is being given for somebody who's wounded and is
Usually,
in pain.
yeah. Wounded or burned, yeah.
Okay.
And like I said, there were also times when, you left your case of threats outside the plastic case and sat on them, which would break them all. So you're stuck with 5 morphine threats you have to account for somehow.
Do you ever have to deal with theft issues?
Actually not, because the first, it sounds kind of chauvinistic, but the first had a really pride about it. And we were a straight unit, and if one of the guys started doing that, the other guys would take care of it.
How?
Beat them up.
Okay.
Somebody.
They end up at the aid station for that?
Sometimes, yeah. I'm not saying there wasn't drugs there, because there were. There was marijuana everywhere. But people didn't smoke in the field. If somebody ever smoked on guard duty, they'd fall down some stairs, even when there weren't any stairs.
And that's
And it
a
would be
euphemism. Fall down the stairs is a euphemism.
That's a cop
for...
euphemism for getting beat up.
Okay.
But you're explaining why the bruises are all over your face. You fell down the stairs.
Okay.
But see, it was usually taken care of that way, and so it never got to administrative punishment. It never got to into the system, because the guys depended on each other, and if you were out in the field high, they couldn't depend on you, and if they couldn't depend on you, you didn't need to be there.
So you were aware of marijuana use. Any others?
Actually, there was a drug called tenuate, which was a form of speed that was issued to us to give to troops that had to be out in the field at long periods of time. It was, kept you awake.
And you guys handed that out?
Yeah, but it did get diverted to recreational use in the rear.
Okay.
But again, in the rear. I even took it once or twice. I never particularly cared for it. I smoked marijuana over there quite a bit.
Okay.
One of the funniest things that ever happened to me was I was sitting in the aid station, and by then we had a new battalion surgeon, Dr. Fancher. Well, I won't go into much detail, but he supported marijuana use. He thought it was good, and we thought it was good. And one evening, but we didn't want to smoke because, you can smell the smoke. And he showed us a trick he learned in college of brewing tea with it. So we would sit around in the evening after the work was done and have a pot of tea and talk.
Pot of teapot?
Yeah, pot tea.
Yeah, yeah.
And one day the battalion commander came in. And what really set us off is he came to Doc Fancher and he said, I hear that there's marijuana use here in this battalion, and I want to know, how do you recognize somebody that's using marijuana? And he's saying this to a group of 4 people that are sitting there drinking pot. And, Don was real great about it. He went through the checklist, the red eyes, the abnormal behavior, went through all that. He said, we could set up a program if you want, to teach people that. He said he'd appreciate it. And he said, do you want a cup of tea? He said, nah, I'm a coffee guy. You medics can drink tea, but, I want coffee.
Marijuana, tenuate. Any other drug use out there?
Well, the
Heroin?
the heroin was mostly in the rear. Again, the guys, see, I was with a line unit, and some of the guys did use it up there, but they usually busted out, went down to Long Bin jail, because the guys wouldn't tolerate that. Marijuana, attenuate, nobody said a whole lot about. Some of the guys brought cocaine back from leave. If you went there, if you went to Kuala Lumpur or Singapore, you could walk into a pharmacy and buy anything you wanted, as long as you knew what the name of it was. And so guys would do that. They'd buy it, and if they got through the inspection on the way back, they'd have it around for a little while. But, you know, I didn't see a lot of heroin use.
Was that tolerated?
Heroin use was not tolerated. The other stuff, because you weren't going to have it that long. You know, you bring back, 10 or 12 speed tablets. As long as you used in the rear, as long as you didn't make trouble for anybody else. You know, there was a subculture that spent a lot of time using it, and then there were people like me that it was a way of fighting boredom.
What about alcohol?
There was a lot of alcohol, but again, it was back in the rear. Nobody drank. Occasionally, they'd lift in a case of beer after a hard firefight. Everybody had one beer, but getting drunk in the field just wasn't tolerated. In the rear, though, it was a different story. You know, the NCO club was selling beer for $5 a bottle, 5 cents a bottle, or 10 cents for a shot of Chivas Regal. So there was a lot of drinking in the clubs.
Okay. And were there clubs at Dao Tiang, or were you far enough forward that was?
No, Dao Tiang. Dao Tiang was our rear base.
Okay.
So we had clubs there, yeah.
Okay. So was there a lot of drinking at Dao Tiang?
Some of the guys drank a lot.
Okay.
Some of the guys didn't.
Okay.
I got spectacularly drunk one night, but that was circumstantial. The day I was promoted to E6, I'm sorry, there was a tradition that you went in the NCO club and laid a $20 bill in the bar and stayed till it was drunk up. You know, everybody in the bar was drinking off it. And, you know, beer's 5 cents, shot 10 cents. You know, $20 goes pretty far. Unfortunately, I got promoted to E6 and came back up from Zion, where I had my board, on a day that there was a battalion minus operation in effect, so there were only 3 people in the NCO club.
So the three of you consumed that $20 worth?
Yeah. That's one of the few blackouts I've had in my life. I was told that I went back to the, we had an aid station, which I said was a nice building, but we also had a tent next to it that we used for overflow. And the tent was empty except for the guy that was on duty that night. And apparently I went back and thought that the tent was standing up too high, so I started taking the side poles down.
Okay, let's
And I was escorted back to bed, and nobody said a thing of it the next day because I didn't do it every day. If I did it every day,
if it was a habit, they'd have been concerned.
yeah.
Okay. You're doing extra duty down in the OR when you can.
Yeah, not often, a couple times a week maybe.
What was that like?
Interesting, because, I had the basic OR training as part of 91C school. 91C was a generalist. I was supposed to be able to walk into the delivery room and function. I was supposed to be able to walk into an ER and function. I was supposed to be able to walk into an operating room and function. Any unit in the hospital, I was supposed to be able to walk in and be comfortable. And I wasn't comfortable with the OR. I needed more experience.
Did you get it?
Oh, I got it. Yeah, because because when they called us was when they had a massive influx, when there was a big firefight, and they had a massive influx, and every room was jumping. And they knew what I wanted, and they knew I was 91C, and so I had the basic training. So they were great about giving me what they thought I needed, and still not endangering the patients.
How many doctors were there?
I have no idea. It was kind of I only went there occasionally. I'd say at least 10 or 12.
Dr. Fancher, did you get to know any of the others?
Well, Dr. Fancher was my battalion surgeon. He had nothing to do with the surgical hospital.
Okay.
Battalion surgeons are assigned to the battalion.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, the surgical hospital was down the road.
yeah, it was a separate entity,
How
which
far
is why.
away?
Oh, I'd say a quarter of a mile.
Oh, okay, so not that far.
Not that far. Close enough that we could drop into their club if we wanted to.
But you did not have a significant amount of interaction with the doctors and the officers there, except when
Except
you were...
when I was working, yeah.
Okay, okay.
I would have liked to because the only women in Daoqiang were the OR nurses.
What sorts of things were you treating?
Mostly gunshot wounds, shrapnels, a lot of burns. What's called in the States multiple trauma.
What were the burns from?
Usually white phosphorus, sometimes from exploding gasoline.
Okay, okay. What was that experience like?
It was interesting. It taught me what I could do and what I didn't know and what I had to learn. And I used it as a learning experience. As a matter of fact, when I graduated from nursing school, my first job was as an OR nurse.
What did you find out you needed to learn?
Well, I knew the basics, but I needed to. The biggest thing in surgery is to work as a team, to anticipate. It's one thing for a doctor to say clamp. It's another thing for a doctor to hold his hand back and have the clamp put in it right away because that's what he needs next.
So you're learning the sequence by which a procedure is done.
Not only the sequence, but you're learning to observe what's going on so that you can anticipate, because every surgery isn't the same. If you open up one guy and he's got one problem, you open up another one, he's got something else. But you've got to know enough about the procedure to know what the doctor's going to need.
What did you think about the doctors down there?
Mostly pretty good. They were all young. They were all fresh out of medical school, or at least most of them were. And so they were well trained and needed a little seasoning too, but
Getting that on the job?
Getting it on the job training, yeah. Military medicine is usually better than civilian medicine because people have to be up on top because you lose more patients if you aren't.
You did lose patients.
Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
Traumatic. Fortunately, I didn't know most of them. And so I was able to have some distance, some professional distance. I did have one experience where one of my medics was wounded. And he went down to the 3rd Field, which was in Saigon. And I got permission to go down to see him. Technically, it was because he had a box of morphine threats in his pocket, and I had to account for it. So I had to go down and see what he'd done with them. That was the excuse I used to go see him. But while he was in the intensive care unit, he'd been wounded when he was working the riverboats, and he died while I was standing next to him, and that was extremely traumatic.
What was his name?
John Edwards.
Do you know where he was from?
No idea. He was, as a matter of fact, he was a fairly new medic. That was his first time in the field.
What do you mean, working the river boats?
Every once in a while, well, there were river boats that went up and down the Mekong River, and every once in a while they'd get a unit of our guys to go beyond them. What they would do is they'd go down the river, land at a likely-looking spot. The infantry would go out and sweep through the river, sweep through the ground, meet up with the riverboat, get back on, go down again. I never did it, so I'm not sure exactly what it was, but that was essentially what it was. That was when we were in YK. We were still down farther south, so that our guys could get down to the Mekong.
And your medic, Edwards,
Yeah.
was wounded. What had happened to him?
An RPGA came out from the bush and hit the boat.
He had multiple traumas?
Yeah. Slivers in his lungs, sliver in his liver.
So you had a pretty good working knowledge of exactly what the wounds were.
Yeah. Yeah, when I went there, I stopped and... See, one thing about being a 91C is it's a small world. And I had guys that worked at the 2nd Surge that I went through school with. So I stopped and saw one of them first to get an update. And then they snuck me in. You weren't supposed to be visiting in the ICU, but since I was a 91C, I could get in. And so I was standing there when he arrested.
So he went flatline?
Yeah.
At that point?
Yeah.
How'd that affect you?
Like I said, I was terribly upset. And I went back to, I was staying with a friend at the 93rd Evac Hospital down there, who I also went through 91C school with. And it's kind of weird, he was a 91C, but he was running the NCO club. His name was Costello. Apparently Costello is a big name in New York bars. And his family had owned bars for generations. And when they found out he was a Costello, they stuck him in the NCO club. So
Everybody needs an Irish barkeep, is that
right,
what they were thinking?
I think so. So anyway, I remember drinking. I think that was only the second time in Vietnam I'd gotten drunk. And I wound up crying the whole night.
Why?
Because I'd lost him.
You lost him?
He was one of my guys.
Okay.
And he was dead.
Okay. Did you lose others that were close to you like that?
No, not over there.
Okay.
I was fairly lucky.
When you say, okay. You were awarded the Bronze Star.
Yeah.
Why?
I was in country 6 months.
Okay.
An E6 got a Bronze Star after 6 months in country.
Okay.
They figured if you're a medic, you're doing something. I also got the Archon,
What's that?
Army Commendation Medal. That's one step. I got that for being in country 3 months.
Okay.
Got the Air Medal for riding helicopters.
And not falling out?
And not falling out, yeah. Okay. If you fall out, they give you a cluster.
Okay.
Actually, the medal I'm proudest of is it's probably not on that list because it's a South Vietnamese medal.
You mentioned something about a South Vietnamese medal.
Yeah, I got the Legion of Merit 3rd class. What happened is this was later, we were working with the Arvin First Rangers, the Republic of Vietnam First Rangers, and they got in a terrible state, and the 2nd and the 28th had to go in and pull them out. And so the battalion commander got Legion of Merit 1st class. The other officers and E7s and above got the Legion of Merit 2nd class. E6s, which I was at the time, and got 3rd class, and everybody else got 4th class. So it was a medal for bravery under fire, helping the South Vietnamese. And the reason I'm proudest of that medal is because at the time, it was the time this all happened, I was in Australia.
Oh.
And to me, it was, a paradigm for the military, that I was an E6, so I deserve this medal, even though I'm in Australia, drinking and chasing women in the bars.
How long were you in Australia?
Just a week. It was the normal R&R.
Okay. What other sorts of things did you learn working in the OR?
I think the most important thing I learned is the fact that I didn't know everything I thought I did, which has stood me in good stead throughout my life, knowing that there's always something more you can learn.
Do you have to deal with battle fatigue, PTSD?
Not then, because if we had somebody that was having problems with that, we'd ship them out.
How far back did you ship them?
We'd ship them to usually the 93rd Evac,
Okay.
which was in Long Binh.
How long would they stay there?
Depends on how bad they were. Sometimes they never came back. If they were really bad, they'd ship them to Japan, and if they were too bad for Japan, they'd ship them to the States.
What did that look like?
What?
When you saw it?
Took two forms. One was almost a manic state, where people would be arguing and yelling and screaming and throwing things and trying to punch people.
They just don't stop moving.
Right. And the other would be almost catatonia, where they just sit in the corner and not say anything, maybe cry.
In your experience, what brought that sort of thing on? What were the contributing factors?
Well, see, this is tempered by what I've learned later, you know, because when I worked at the VA, I worked in psychiatric nursing the whole time. And a lot of it was predisposing factors. Some genetic, some environmental, some developmental.
What would those predisposing factors be?
Well, I think the easiest way of putting it is one of the truisms we used to use in addiction. What matters isn't what happens to you, it's how you react to it. You know, if people learn to be powerless, then they're powerless. If people learn to flail out when they're upset, they flail out. And when people learn you gotta assimilate the data and try to make the best of it, that's what they do.
So those who are poorly equipped to do that
Yeah.
have the toughest time with the circumstances?
Yep, and one of the groups that's traditionally the poorest equipped to handle that at all are teenagers. And who did we send to Vietnam? The 18 and 19-year-olds.
Why is that? Why are they?
Because they don't have enough life experience to learn how to cope with stress.
Okay.
You know, a lot of kids fresh out of high school where their parents kept them out, you know, kept them fairly well protected. All of a sudden they're in the Army being shot at by a bunch of people they don't know and don't really dislike. So why are these people shooting at me?
What was the incidence of PTSD, would you say?
Well, it's tricky because PTSD usually doesn't show up till later.
Okay.
If you're talking about a complete breakdown in combat, that was fairly rare.
Okay.
PTSD often doesn't show up for years.
In the combat setting, this manic or catatonic response.
I think I saw maybe 4 cases of it the year I was over there.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, I'm sure there were others, but those are what I personally dealt with.
Okay. Looking at it in retrospect, knowing what you know now, what sorts of things did you see now? You would look and say, I'm starting to see things that I know are going to cause problems later on.
Yeah.
What sorts of things?
Basically, people coming back and brooding when they're back. You know, functioning okay in the field, but coming back and either drinking or brooding or isolating themselves. That happened fairly often. And that was usually shrugged off as, oh, they're just letting off steam, you know. Come back, get drunk, maybe get in a couple fights.
So fighting, did you see fighting as a release or as...
It could be.
Okay. Was it healthy or not?
Depends on the person.
Okay.
Depends on, you know, how the person viewed it, how the person dealt with it. I mean, you know, it's really hard to deal in absolutes when you're dealing with people.
Okay. How much STDs did you have to deal with?
Quite a few. We had some interesting strains of venereal warts, especially.
Okay.
One of my least pleasant jobs was, since I was the 91C and able to do surgical procedures, I was the one that had to put the medication on it that burned them off. Double gloved.
Okay. Why don't we'll shut down
Okay,
there and
good.
come back. You want to step out, you want to get a drink, use the restroom?
No, I'm okay now.
Okay. Were you diabetic when you went over there?
No,
Something came on later?
They found that Vietnam vets are 8 to 9 times as likely to be diabetic as non-Vietnam vets. But the government insists it has nothing to do with Agent Orange. But if you're diabetic, they automatically give you a 20% service connection if you're a Vietnam vet. But they won't admit that they're at fault.
So they acknowledge that it's service associated. In some...
Well, they give you a service connection, which is, very... But they... Because I almost didn't go to Kent State, because I got my approval to get out of the Army early.
No, no.
Oh, okay. There's a comic book called Knights of the Dinner Table, which I'm on the cover.
Oh, all right. So you're a D&D guy.
Yeah, because of Vietnam.
Okay.
It's
Ready to go?
ready to go.
Okay. We're on our second tape now. This is Steve Brown. It is July 17th, 2008. We are in Hudson, Ohio. And we are talking with Mr. Bob Kindel about his experience in the military. We've taken you through Like. We've been talking about Dao Tiang and fun things like treating syphilis and venereal warts. Anything else that was noteworthy in your mind of your experience there?
A couple things. One is the mindset of people. One of the big problems we had when African Americans came in country was convincing them that they could get sunburned. We would have people that say, I'm from Mississippi and I've never been sunburned in my life. And 3 days later, I was having to soak them in a bathtub full of oatmeal and apply calamine lotion to them because they got sunburned.
What was it about Vietnam that was different from Mississippi?
The tropical sun. The fact that it's
Closer to the equator?
Yeah, that the sun is bright, sun burns faster. It usually helped that it was 100, 200, 100 degrees, 105, plus this. And so, just convincing people that they had to do what they had to do, and that was hard.
Okay. Did you notice? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying that that's just the thing that springs out. Another thing is that, as I said, I was working with essentially teenagers, 18 and 19-year-olds. I was the old man in the unit because I was 21 when I was over there. I could legally drink before I went to Vietnam. Teenagers are immortal. And so, the accidents are going to happen to somebody else. They're not going to happen to me. I'll be fine.
Do you have any observations about race relations in the Army at that time?
It was difficult because, as I said, the African Americans were a major part of our unit, and yet they wanted to isolate themselves from the white part of the unit. And so there was a division. We worked together, we respected each other, but there was always a distance. I hear in some units it got to be very, very bad. I know the 1st and the 2nd had a reputation for having a lot of fights. But for some reason we were okay. 2nd and 28th, like I said, sometimes it was an armed truce, but it was. But we worked together.
Okay.
I had one African American friend that funniest thing that ever happened to me, John was part of.
What was that?
Well, there was in Vietnam a lizard. I have no idea what its real name is. It was a type of gecko, but everybody called it the fuck you lizard because you've heard of it. One day I'm sitting there in my room reading. Back in the rear, I had one of the nice things about Dao Tiang is I was in E6. I had my own room. That's the first time in my life I ever had a room of my own. I'm one of 8 kids. And I hear a lizard on the screen, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. And all of a sudden it starts saying, fuck you, Kindel, fuck you, Kindel. And I turn around and it's John wearing a pair of very, very tight swim trunks, spread-eagled on my screen.
Like one of these lizards.
Like
only
one of
a
the
lot
lizards.
Bigger.
Yeah, and more personal.
Oh, okay. Any other memories like that?
Not really. We had fun over there. I know it sounds funny to say we had fun, but you had to amuse yourself the best way you could. We had a pickup cricket game once, and if you can imagine,
Where did you guys learn to play cricket?
There was an Australian engineering group there, and it was stationed in Dao Tiang, and we had a very close relationship with them because Australians have this reputation for drinking a lot, and they were having trouble getting supplies of beer. And we had a tendency to have what they called contraband weapons, war souvenirs, basically, and some of which were 9mm. And the Australian troops used 9mm ammunition, so they'd come over and trade us 9mm ammunition for a couple cases of beer. And one day we sat around talking, and I commented that I'd seen a cricket game once, and I had no idea what it was. It didn't make sense. I said, it's not like baseball, it makes sense. And they started telling me how baseball didn't make any sense. And so after a couple beers, it made sense to get a couple flat boards and learn how to play cricket.
What'd you use for the ball?
Softball.
Okay.
Which is not tradition. The Australians had a lot of trouble with that, but they didn't have any cricket gear back at their camp either. But we used we had ammunition boxes, so somebody broke those out and made the wicket, and then we took another one and kind of smoothed it off for a handle to use as the... And so we tried to learn to play cricket. That was...
Did that go on for a while, or was that
a couple hours. It went on all afternoon, actually. It was a quiet day.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, we had... It was supposedly a UN effort. We had the Australians with us. We had a group of Koreans, and they were very strange because they had this. Well, for one, they all seemed to be martial artists. We'd go by their formation. They'd be practicing karate, which we thought was kind of odd in the sun. But they also had a tendency to salute NCOs. In the Korean Army, apparently, you saluted NCOs, and they always saluted me because I had my, once I made E6, I didn't have a complete set of insignia. So I had a black E6 on one collar and a gold E6 on the other, which from a distance made me look like a major.
Yeah. Did you ever get that response from American troops?
Yeah, and I just sort of shrugged.
Okay.
The battalion commander asked me about it once, and I said the PX were out of complete sets.
Okay.
He didn't mess with the medics very much because no one did. We were considered the oddballs of the unit.
Why?
Well, because we tended to be better educated than most of the troops. We tended to be, because we had to work together, we had a lot of respect for each other, and so the barriers of rank weren't that important. As I said, when nobody else was around, I called Doc Fancher Don because that was his name.
Do you know where he is today?
He's in Hawaii.
Okay.
I just got a Christmas card from him about 3 years ago. We don't keep in close touch. We were never that close, but every once in a while we get in touch.
What was your perception of how the troops viewed medics?
As goofballs you needed to stay on the good side of because they'd keep you alive.
They appreciate you guys?
Oh, yeah. Medics in the field always had at least one bodyguard. Because the first thing you did was you put your gun down. You couldn't make a house call dragging a gun, so you had a bodyguard that would keep an eye on you while you went out.
Is that what you call them, house calls?
Yeah. That's from an old Bill Cosby routine.
Oh, okay.
Where Bill Cosby was talking about being a medic in the Army when he was in the Army. And he said, they told you if you were wounded you'd call us, but somebody called medic, and he said, I don't make house calls. Ah. So we called it making house calls.
Okay.
We made them.
Yeah, yeah.
Fortunately, I never had to make one. But
how long were you at Dao Tiang?
4 months.
Then
Last 4 months of my tour.
Then you went home.
Yep.
What was your impression when you got home?
Again, like I said, everybody's impression is a little different, but I didn't have any of the problems I've heard a lot of Vietnam vets talk about. Part of it was probably situational. I flew home on a plane that caught the tail end of a hurricane. So we got in, with that tailwind, we got in 3 hours early. So we landed at Oakland in the middle of the night. I caught a taxi. After I processed, I caught a taxi to San Francisco Airport, crossed the Golden Gate in the middle of the night, so I've never seen the Golden Gate Bridge except, under lights. Flew home to Chicago in the middle of a blizzard. I got a reserved seat on the plane because I didn't want to fool with standby. Fortunately, because I caught the last plane out of Chicago before it closed for a blizzard, landed in Cleveland wearing a summer uniform, having been used to 120-degree temperatures in the middle of a horrible blizzard. Fortunately, my father kept the car running, so the heater was there. And I was met by my fiance and mother with 6 blankets.
Okay. What did you do immediately after you got home? What sorts of things?
Visited old friends, planned the wedding.
Okay.
I was going to get married 10 days after I got home. That was pretty much it. After 3 days, I crashed and slept for 36 hours because I couldn't sleep when I first got home.
Why not?
Well, I just crossed 24 time zones in the international date line.
It was a time.
I mean, it was talking. I've heard people kid about jet lag, but I've never felt like that in my life because I was almost hyper for 2.5 days, and then I crashed for 36 hours.
Just by way of explanation for anybody who's watching this later on, the fiance, you lost her just 2 months ago.
Right.
So that's kind of tough for you right now. Okay. At what point did you decide I need to go back to school?
The day after I got out of the Army. Well, actually, while I was still in the Army. I knew I was going to go back and get my degree.
And you were looking to a degree in English.
Right.
Okay.
And I was going to go back to Kent State. And I went to Walter Reed. I was stationed at Walter Reed, and I was working in the ICU, surgical ICU at Walter Reed. Where there again, you talk about, all this disrespect people got when they got back. I walked into the Walter Reed orderly room, to report in, wearing 3 rows of medals, First Division patch, combat medical badge, Vietnamese medal over here.
The one you got in Australia?
Yeah, the one. Well, the one I earned in Australia.
Okay.
Whatever. And I walk in looking like a Christmas tree, and all these people had no idea what to do with me. I got all kinds of respect at Walter Reed. And Washington is a government town, so they're not going to have a lot of anti-war protesters. So, I missed the worst of it.
Okay.
And the only thing people had to figure out when I got to Walter Reed is, what are we going to do with this guy? Because he's an E6, but he's already saying he's not going to re-enlist. He's going to be out in 7 months. So they stuck me in surgical intensive care because that's someplace I could work.
Why was that difficult for them to figure out what to do with you?
Because usually in E6 you'd put in an administrative post and groom them for E7.
Okay.
And I'd already told them that I don't care what they offer me, I'm not staying in.
Why was that?
Because I didn't particularly like the military.
Okay.
I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do, but I'd done it. It's somebody else's turn.
Okay. And I'm sorry, what were you doing then at Walter Reed?
Working in the surgical intensive care unit. I was the assistant ward master, which means I was in charge of the 3 to 11 shift.
Okay. What was that like?
Interesting, because as I said, I had the experience I needed, but I needed some practice, and it taught me a lot.
Such as?
Basically, the basic care techniques. It taught me the equipment. Walter Reed had the ice. I know Walter Reed's gotten a bad rap because some of the units were pits, but the surgical intensive care had the up-to-date equipment. And I learned how to handle all these things that I'd only read about, the MA1 respirator and stuff like that, which again stood me in good stead when I went to nursing school.
At what point did you make the decision to go to nursing school?
Well, I got out of the Army. As I said, I was only going to be in 7 months, and I applied for a 3-month early out. And I applied for that to go back to Kent State in April of 1970. And it was apparently processing when the May 4th shootings happened. And my CO called me in and said, we can throw this away because Kent State isn't going to open up. And I had to get a letter from the dean of Kent State saying, yes, they were going to have classes in September in order for them to finish processing my early outs so I could get out and go back to school.
So you went back to school at Kent State?
Yep. I went. I was married by then, so I was again working part-time, going to school full-time, working on using the GI Bill to supplement my income. And after about 2 semesters, I realized that if I went ahead and got the degree in English, which was going to take me another 1.5 years, I probably wouldn't have a job. Where on the other hand, people were lining up to hire me as an LPN, and I thought about what they would do if I got the BSN, the bachelor's degree in nursing, became a registered nurse. So I switched majors. I hear now it's really difficult to get into nursing school. There I walked over to the School of Nursing, and I asked somebody how you would get into School of Nursing, and they talked to me a little bit, got my background. When they heard I'd been a 91C, they said, well, next semester we'll take this course, and this course. We'll start you in the sophomore nursing program the next semester.
Okay. What was it like being at Kent State as a veteran at that time?
Not a problem, because Kent, oddly enough, was the center of a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which was a anti-war group. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the more effective anti-war groups because in order to really want peace, you have to experience war. Otherwise you're just, a dilettante. It's mostly the people that have actually been exposed to war that want peace. And once, I wasn't a member of that group, but I was a fellow traveler. And I knew a lot of people in the group, and they knew me, and they knew that, I was cool.
Okay.
So again, I had no trouble at Kent State. Even though the anti-war movement was very strong, the people respected my opinions. Which was, I went because it was the right thing to do, even though I thought the war was stupid.
What about people on the right? Did you have difficulties with them?
Not really, because all they saw was the fact that I was a veteran. Okay. That I'd actually been to Vietnam, so he's one of our boys. So, and I kept a low key, because I just wanted to get, by that time I had a one-year-old.
Okay. Eventually, you went to work for the Veterans Administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you've worked quite a few years in substance abuse counseling?
Yeah, well, I went to the Veterans Administration in 1977, 2 years after I graduated from nursing school. I had a 2-year commitment at Mount Sinai because they gave me a scholarship the last 2 years I was in. I had to work for them for 2 years. And I was working the OR, and then I went to teach. I was going to teach OR techniques, but they changed me to pediatrics at the last minute because they weren't going to start the class, which is one of the reasons I didn't stay at that school. They're just too disorganized. And then I decided, well, I'm 30 years old. I really need to get a job where I can get a pension. And at that point, when you worked for the VA, you could get a civil service pension, which is a very good pension. I can tell you that because I'm on it now. They did away with it 5 years after I went to work. They've got a Social Security-based thing now that's not quite as good. Anyway, so I decided I'd go to the VA. And I applied for a job in the OR at Brecksville VA Hospital a month after they closed the OR in Brecksville. And I talked to the director of nursing, and she said, oh, that's no problem. You've got a lot of good experience. We can put you to use. You're hired. They hired me on a conditional basis until all the paperwork was done. And they stuck me in psychiatry. And I worked as a psych nurse for a year, and then I started graduate school.
Where'd you do your graduate school?
At Kent State. Yeah. And
what were you studying then?
Psychiatric nursing.
Okay.
With a minor in administration. And they said, we're going to put you on nights so you can go to school. And as long as you're on nights, we need a night supervisor. At this point I'd worked at the VA less than a year, but I had all this experience behind me. And I was a male, which in nursing used to count a lot. So I wound up in administration. So I was the night supervisor for a 1.5 years. And at the end of that, they wanted to fast track me into the administrative position, become a chief nurse. And I said, before you do that, I've got a lot of psychiatric experience. I've got a lot of medical experience. What I don't have is addiction experience. Why don't you give me the next slot in addiction? I'll work there 6 months and then I'll come back. And they stuck me, the next slot was in a substance unit, so I took it. And I realized that I enjoyed that a lot more than I enjoyed being an administrator. That actually I was a good administrator, but I wasn't happy doing it. So the next 27 years, I worked in addiction.
Did you deal with a lot of Vietnam vets in that situation?
Yeah, quite a few. As a matter of fact, we had a special program for Vietnam vets that also had PTSD. It was a combined dual diagnosis program.
What were you seeing there?
Guys that had been masking PTSD for 10, 15 years because of the drinking. They were using the alcohol to medicate themselves so that they wouldn't go full-blown crazy from the PTSD. And eventually it got to the point where something had to be done, and they admitted something had to be done, and then they'd come in. That's the one biggest thing about PTS and Vietnam veterans is that we were taught to suck it up, John Wayne. And so some of these guys sucked it up for 15, 20 years before they finally realized they still had problems.
What kind of problems?
Nightmares. We'd have guys that would have nightmares for 4 or 5 times a week if they weren't drunk. They'd still have them if they were drunk, but they'd be in a blackout and wouldn't remember them then.
Other things?
Getting angry easily, a lot of hostility, a lot of spouse abuse. They had to lash out against something, so they lashed out against whatever was there.
What were you able to do to help them?
Biggest thing was to get them out of the situation where they could sit down and think about, do you have a problem? And if you have a problem, what are you going to do about it?
And what would you do about the PTSD aspect of it?
Well, we had people that were trained in that. There were a lot of different therapies, and I could enumerate them, but I'm not an expert on it, because basically what I could do with PTSD is diagnose it, not spot it. Technically, I couldn't diagnose because I'm a nurse, and nurses in Ohio aren't allowed to diagnose. But I did have a test that I could administer that if they reached a certain score on it, then I would send them to one of the experts. And, they did a lot of different things. They did regression therapy, they did memory therapy, sometimes they'd hypnotize, sometimes they'd just sit there and talk it out and cry it out till it was out. Because the biggest problem with them is they wouldn't talk about it.
What did you think about that experience?
I'm glad I could help. Taught me a lot about my experiences too, because there was some trauma there. Like I said, I had a good war as opposed to some guys, so it wasn't quite as bad, but there were things I needed to talk about that I didn't.
Such as?
The death I was telling you about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Waking up in the middle of the night with rockets coming in.
What was that like?
First couple times it happened, it was scary.
Set up at Like
Yeah, Like was where it started. We used to call it Rocket Alley. They'd hit us at least 3-4 times a day. They'd fire 5 or 6 rockets and then have to get out because otherwise counterfire would take over. And so you just got used to never knowing when it was going to come in, that sense of, watchful anticipation, of drastic events.
Based on your experience, what sort of effect does that have on a human psyche?
Depends on the psyche. As I was saying, it's hard to make. I know, to me, what it did is it kind of hardened me to that. So I quit waiting. Like I said, the first couple rocket attacks were bad. After that, I would roll off my bed and roll under my bed. I wouldn't bother going out to the bunker because the rockets probably weren't going to hit me. If you could hear them, they'd already landed. Made me a cynic. Because like I said, I knew that if they fired too many in a row, then counterfire would take over. and they never had enough that they could hit us from 3 different places at once, which would have made sense. You know, fire here, wait for the counterfire, and then fire here. And then, but they never did that because they apparently couldn't get enough rockets set up. So usually, once you heard them coming in, you were safe. But again, you know, if you know that sense of anticipation, that's grating on a person. You know, that constant watchfulness. That's one of the things that develops paranoia. Which is another thing you saw in Vietnam vets, is that they didn't trust the government. So where were they coming for help? A government hospital.
Did you think that was an unreasonable distrust?
Not, well, I'm a veteran myself, and so I'll say that I didn't totally trust the VA, but I trusted the VA medical people. You know, I didn't trust the administrative part. But, you know, as a matter of fact, I go to, you know, since I'm service-connected, I'm eligible for medical treatment at the VA, and that's where I go, because even though I got good enough insurance, I could go anywhere. I think it was unreasonable.
Okay.
And, but one of the things we had to deal with was we had certain, we'd often get a person that would come into our unit, and you know, they'd say, okay, well, I'll take treatment, but I'll only have Bob do it. I won't go to them because they're not a Vietnam vet, so they wouldn't understand.
How did that work out for you?
Well, I would usually get to know the client, and then I'd say, you know, that's one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. Because, you know, because in addiction, you have to be honest with the person. You know, you can't pussyfoot around, you can't be nice, you got to go for the balls, essentially. I say, because you realize that since I'm a Vietnam vet, I'm biased. And if you want really good care, you need an objective person. I say, I can give you good care, but, you know, Bev Donovan, you know, who's the person in charge of the Vietnam group, she's much better at this than I am. So, I mean, if you want second or third rate care, you know, you can talk to me, sure, but, you know, if I were you, I'd go to Bev.
How did they respond to that?
Well, most of them responded fairly well because they knew I was honest.
Okay.
See, because that's, you know, people get reputations in a hospital, especially in a community like an addiction center where people keep coming back. And my reputation, I've been told by several people, was Kindel's a hard nose, but he won't lie to you. You know, he won't give you what you want half the time, but he won't lie to you. And I would never say what I just said about Bev Donovan about some of my other colleagues. You know, they knew that if I said somebody was good, they were good. You know, I wasn't just saying that because they worked for the VA. So one of them once point blank asked me, well, how about Dave Leventhal? I said, well, I'd go to Bev Donovan if I were you. Wouldn't talk about Dave, but I kept telling him to go to, because Dave was a great administrator, but he was a lousy clinician. I wouldn't say he was a lousy clinician, I just kept referring him over to somebody else, and he got the point.
Okay.
But he wanted to go to Dave because Dave was a guy and Bev was a woman.
Is that a problem for Vietnam vets?
It can be.
Okay.
I mean, there again, if it's a problem for a person, there's a lot of problems. A lot of people have trouble with women in general. You know, as a matter of fact, I had one of my clients once that saw me down in the medical clinic. You know, he's not a client anymore because I don't work there anymore. He's saying, "Who are you seeing?" I said, "Oh, I'm seeing Dr. Hovis." He said, "Well, I'd never go to a woman." I say, "She's the best doctor I've had."
While we're on the issue of gender, you mentioned there were nurses at some places you were at.
Yeah.
What was your observation of gender issues in the military in the time you were in there?
Oh, women were definitely subservient. You know, women couldn't be trusted in a position of authority because, you know, they're too emotional. That's not my opinion. That's, you know, I'm echoing the times.
Okay. What did you think?
I thought if you gave them a chance, they'd probably be okay, but they got to get the chance first. Okay. But don't forget that before I went into the Army, I'd worked in hospitals for several years, and I saw a lot of good women administrators. You know, I had a lot of, you know, again, it's the role models you grow up with. You know, I saw nurses that were just as hard-nosed as any guy. So
You, could you, in a few short words, summarize your military experience and your impressions of First Division in particular?
Okay, my general medical experience, my general military experience is, if I can go back to Shakespeare, a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, essentially. It's a lot, there was more effort put on appearances than actual what you were doing. First Division was a little different because First Division, as I said, did have some pride about it, unlike some of the units. And there were a lot of bozos in command. But there were also a lot of good officers that knew what they were doing, a lot of good NCOs that knew what they were doing. Even I think I knew what I was doing. But there was a pride in the unit that I didn't see in a lot of units.
And you were around other units.
Oh yeah, I mean we used to, we were around First Cav, and First Cav. First thing guys in the First would say, well, they've lost their colors twice. Because they did. They lost their division headquarters were overrun twice. Once in Korea, once in Vietnam. And when you overrun a headquarters, you take the flags, the colors. First Division was never lost their colors. And that's, even our unit, the 2nd and 28th, our unit crest was a black lion, rampant and regardant, as they would say in heraldry. And that's the town crest of the town of Cantigny in France, Cantigny in France, which was the first major battle fought by the Americans in World War I. The ones the British threw the 28th in as cannon fodder, so that they could come in the next day, only to find out that the 28th took the town anyway. They weren't ready to be cannon fodder. And with that kind of background, and that history was taught. The senior NCOs would actually talk about that at the NCO club, the history of the First. The fact that we had the history of being, at the Sicily invasion, Operation Torch in World War II, where we invaded North Africa, Normandy. First was always the unit you sent in. It got to be a joke, though, in Vietnam, because when the First Division was sent to Vietnam, that was First Division sent over to Vietnam, they decided they were going to storm the beaches. And they did. They stormed the beaches at a seaside resort where there were a bunch of people sitting there having drinks, watching this division come storming in, and rather than, just flying in like a normal division. But that was part of the pride, I guess. I don't know.
So part of the way of transmitting this knowledge was just an oral tradition.
Yeah.
Of NCOs sitting around and talking with other
Yeah,
NCOs.
usually it's the NCOs. The officers didn't do it as much. Okay. And there was, like I said, there were some things that we did in our unit that they didn't do in a lot of units, like the fact that the guys took care of one another. That if you screwed up on guard duty, it wasn't just shrugged off. You actually did something about it, rather than let the officers send you along in jail.
That would be the falling down the staircase kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
I treated a lot of those. Not a lot, because it didn't have to happen often to people to get the message.
Anything else you'd like to add that I failed to talk about, that we failed to cover here, that you think is significant that you'd like to?
Not really. Just the important thing to remember, I think, is, and it's so easy to lump everybody together. Remember that everybody had a different war. Unlike earlier wars, we didn't go over as a unit, and there was no sense of camaraderie. I think that was the trouble with a lot of units, that there was no sense of unit integrity, because in past wars you trained together, you went over together, you came home together. Here, I walked into the aid station one day with my orders and said, "Hi, I'm Bob Kindel, your new 91C." And the guy looked up and said, "You can't be a 91C, you only need 4. I said, "Oh, I'm a screw-up, but I'm still a 91C."
Do you think that has had an impact on the veterans?
Oh, definitely.
Of Vietnam?
I think that was the biggest reason that Vietnam vets tended to have PTSD, is that there was that sense of isolation, that sense of, my DRO date, my date of going home is such and such. Yours is such and such, yours is such and such, but I came over by myself, I'm going home by myself. There's that sense of, I got to do it on my own.
Do you think that made it harder for them to develop a sense of reliance on the guy next to them?
Yeah, until you learned what they could do. It also, I think, is a major factor for problems after you got home.
Okay.
Especially, I was lucky. I didn't think so at the time, but I think I was, because a lot of guys were in Daotiang one day, flew down to Benoit the next day, and 36 hours later they were in civilian clothes on the street.
And why did
I had the time at Walter Reed to decompress, to talk to other veterans, to sort of get back used to life in the States before I had to go hit the street. And like I said, at the time I didn't really want to stay in the service, but I think it was good for me.
Any other thoughts you want to share?
Not really.
Okay. Well, Mr. Kindel, on behalf of Ball State, on behalf of the First Division Foundation, I'd like to thank you, and my family would like to thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you. And we're clear.
And I've got something.